Welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Our dear listeners, unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving our channel without the necessary budget to continue operating and supporting our creators. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider helping us with a contribution of just $1, so our team can cover their living expenses and keep crafting these sci-fi worlds for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and the comment section. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was a monument to absolute perfection. For countless millennia, it had stood as the beacon of logic, order, and immaculate mathematics across the stars. Every pillar, every curve of its architecture was calculated to the absolute decimal, reflecting a society that had conquered chaos. Yet, on this rotation, the silence within the command nexus was not one of peace. It was the silence of a tomb. Supreme Commander Xylar stood motionless before the central tactical projection, his silver eyes reflecting the cold, pale light of a dying galaxy. The enemy had no name in any known tongue, so the Council had designated them the Axiom. They were not an empire of flesh and bone. The Axiom were entities of pure crystalline energy, shifting and pulsating with an ethereal, chilling beauty. They did not conquer out of malice, nor did they slaughter out of hatred. Such primitive emotions were entirely absent from their structural matrix. Instead, they assimilated. They moved through space like a silent tide of geometric perfection, touching planets, stars, and living beings alike. Whatever the Axiom touched was instantly transfigured into flawless, static, and utterly lifeless spatial geometries. They were turning the messy, vibrant universe into a silent, frozen gallery of crystal statues. Xylar watched the projection as the greatest fleets ever assembled by the Council engaged the anomaly. These ships were the pinnacle of engineering, fighting with flawless algorithms and absolute precision. Millions of tactical drones executed maneuvers with microscopic accuracy, firing laser arrays that could vaporize a moon. But logic could not pierce the void. As the concentrated beams struck the advancing crystal tide, the energy was simply absorbed, refracted, and geometrically reorganized. Xylar watched in suffocating dread as the communication feeds from the Vanguard went dark, one by one. There were no explosions. There were no screams of agony over the communication channels. The Council fleets were simply enveloped, their molecular structures rewritten in a fraction of a second, leaving only colossal, silent crystal monuments drifting aimlessly in the void. The Grand Omniscience Engine, a supercomputer spanning the mass of a small planet, hummed softly as it processed the incoming variables. It analyzed billions of tactical permutations, searching for a single flaw in the advancing enemy. The final result manifested on the holographic display hovering before Xylar. "The probability of victory is absolute 0%, the chief tactician announced, his voice trembling in a room that had not known fear for ages. There was no margin for error, no hidden variable to exploit. The concept of retreating did not even exist within the behavioral paradigm of the Axiom. To them, this was not a war. It was merely a systemic purge. They were meticulously cleaning up an equation teeming with errors. And the Galactic Council, with all its organic imperfections and biological inefficiencies, was the error that needed to be corrected. Despair, an emotion long suppressed by the Council elites, now gripped Xylar by the throat. Logic had failed. Mathematics had brought them to their knees. If perfect order could not stop the Axiom, perhaps they needed the exact opposite. Xylar turned toward the High Consuls, his voice devoid of its usual measured cadence. "Order has failed us. If perfection cannot stop them, we must unleash chaos. I authorize the immediate breach of Dark Quarantine Zone Number 9. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. Dark Quarantine Zone. Number 9 was a chaotic sector of space that had been sealed off from the rest of the galaxy for centuries. It was a restricted, lawless void, home to a species deemed so exceptionally wild, so terrifyingly aggressive, and so utterly devoid of logic that their very existence was classified as an anomaly. The Council had locked them away, confident that their internal conflicts and reckless nature would inevitably lead to their own self-destruction. To break the seal was heresy against the order. But facing the cold, crystal assimilation of the Axiom, heresy was the only weapon they had left. With a heavy hand, Xylar entered the final command sequence. Deep within the archives, an ancient relay activated. A distress package, encoded with the most heavily guarded cryptographic algorithms, was beamed directly into the heart of the chaotic sector. The transmission carried the entirety of their accumulated data regarding the Axiom, alongside the exact coordinates of the Council core worlds. Xylar stared into the blackness of the space projection, waiting. No one in the command nexus truly expected a response. The prevailing consensus was that the primitive species locked within that dark zone had likely eradicated themselves centuries ago. Yet, as the flawless crystalline doom encroached upon their borders, this plea cast into the dark was their final, fading hope. Just 3 hours after the distress signal faded into the black, the fundamental fabric of reality screamed. There was no elegant folding of dimensions, no smooth transition through hyperspace gates, like the sophisticated vessels of the Galactic Council utilized. Instead, the void simply shattered. A violent, jagged fissure ripped violently across the tactical projection screens of the command nexus, emitting a massive gravitational shockwave that rattled the pristine, shock-absorbent architecture of the Grand Hall. Space itself was being violently punched open from the outside, a crude and brutal intrusion into the local system. Through these ragged, bleeding cracks in the cosmic membrane, toxic cosmic radiation bled out in sickening hues of violet and harsh green, deeply polluting the sterile emptiness of the battlefield. Then came the Leviathans. They dragged their massive bulks out of the chaotic rift, like rusted, ancient predators waking from a long, angry slumber. If the Council fleets were considered elegant silver droplets of water flowing through the void, these human vessels were jagged boulders of slag, iron, and titanium. They were colossal, asymmetrical monstrosities constructed from dark, heavy alloys that bore the deep, ugly scars of countless unknown conflicts. Patched metal plates overlapped haphazardly, crudely welded together in a brutalist defiance of any known aesthetic logic. Massive, protruding kinetic gun barrels bristled fiercely along their armored spines like iron bristles on a rabid beast. There was no clean, silent energy hum here. Their gargantuan thrusters violently belched torrents of dense, black plasma that permanently stained the starfield, leaving thick, choking trails of radioactive cosmic soot in their wake. The sheer industrial ugliness of the human fleet was a profound visual insult to the delicate sensibilities of the Council. Yet, the raw, kinetic menace radiating from every inch of their hulls was absolutely undeniable. Before Supreme Commander Xylar could even order a preliminary defensive posture against this terrifying new presence, the Council's supposedly impenetrable firewall networks were brutally bypassed. No access codes were requested, and no digital handshakes were offered. The main holographic display in the Nexus forcefully shifted, instantly terminating the strategic tactical feed. It was replaced by the raw, unfiltered interior view of a human command bridge. The contrast was physically jarring to the elites in the room. Instead of softly glowing panels and immaculate white surfaces, the human environment was dark, cramped, and illuminated only by harsh, flashing amber warning lights and sparking conduits. Standing at the absolute center of this metallic chaos was Admiral Frank Bush. He wore no ceremonial armor, no grand robes of state, and displayed no medals of honor. His uniform was a heavy, olive-drab fabric, purely utilitarian and heavily stained with dark engine grease and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. His face was weathered, deeply lined with heavy creases, and covered in a rough, untamed shadow of a graying beard. He possessed an air of profound, chilling indifference, his dark eyes narrowed and calculating beneath a pair of heavy brows. At that very moment, Council tactical sensors indicated that exactly 20,000 Axiom crystal entities were immediately shifting their geometric trajectory toward the human vanguard. Frank completely ignored the impending doom. Instead, he lazily raised a thick, chipped ceramic mug to his lips, taking a long, deliberate sip of steaming black coffee. Xylar, desperately trying to regain a fraction of his diplomatic composure, activated the highest priority secure comms line. Human Admiral, I am Supreme Commander Xylar of the Galactic Council. We are transmitting our coordinated grid protocols to your navigation computers right now. You must integrate your forces into our central command structure immediately to form a unified defensive perimeter against the enemy. Frank slowly lowered his mug, wiping his mouth with the back of a calloused hand. When he spoke, his voice was a grating, gravelly baritone that sounded like heavy machinery grinding without oil. It completely lacked any hint of diplomatic grace or galactic etiquette. Keep your protocols, Commander, Frank rasped, waving a dismissive hand directly at the visual pickup. We do not share the helm, and we sure as hell do not do defensive perimeters. We saw exactly what your perfect little mathematical formations accomplished out there. Absolutely nothing. Xylar stepped forward, his silver eyes wide with frantic, uncharacteristic urgency. You do not understand the fundamental nature of this enemy. They operate on absolute mathematical superiority. If you do not calculate your approach vectors precisely, your entire fleet will be entirely assimilated in a matter of seconds. A cold, incredibly dangerous smirk spread slowly across Frank's scarred face. He leaned closer to the camera, his intense gaze piercing right through the digital divide, carrying the weight of a species born in fire. You fight with mathematics, Frank stated, his tone dripping with absolute, unshakable certainty. We fight with life. Just stand aside and watch how those with errors fix the universe. The communication connection severed instantly, leaving behind a harsh burst of audio static. The holographic display abruptly reverted to the battlefield overwatch, just in time for the Council to witness a spectacle of pure, unadulterated madness. The human armada did not spread out into a tactical net. They did not calculate firing arcs, and they completely ignored standard defensive screening maneuvers. Instead, a terrifying, low-frequency hum began to violently resonate across the entire system, registering on Council sensors as a massive, catastrophic violation of thermodynamic laws. The humans were not arming conventional weapons. They were powering up something the Council had strictly banned millions of years ago. They were igniting entropy engines. Massive, violently swirling vortexes of unstable, chaotic energy abruptly erupted from the heavily armored core housings of the human dreadnoughts. This was not clean, efficient power. It was raw, unbridled degradation harvested and weaponized. The fundamental laws of physics were being actively tortured, inverted, and harnessed. The very space around the human fleet began to physically boil and radically distort, reality itself intensely protesting the forced existence of such a volatile, destructive force. And then, they moved. The entire Iron Armada thrusted forward as a single, terrifyingly disorganized swarm. They did not fire a single probing volley. They did not attempt to flank or outmaneuver the perfect, unyielding geometric formations of the Axiom, with thick black plasma violently screaming from their overcharged engines. The ugly, scarred ships of humanity plunged headfirst, accelerating at maximum velocity, directly into the dead center of the flawless, crystalline matrix. It was a completely suicidal, logic-defying charge. The council elites stood utterly frozen in absolute shock. Their breath caught tightly in their throats as the chaotic, rusty hammer of mankind smashed violently into the immaculate, silent anvil of the Axiom. The moment the rusted, bruised hulls of the human fleet violently breached the silent, pristine lines of the Axiom, the fundamental laws of the universe were brutally rewritten. The Galactic Council had expected to witness a primitive barrage of kinetic projectiles, or perhaps a desperate volley of rudimentary thermonuclear detonations. Instead, they bore witness to the weaponization of pure, unadulterated madness. The human dreadnoughts did not fire coherent light lasers, nor did they launch missiles carrying payloads of destructive thermal energy. They fired anomalies, massive rotary cannons, protruding menacingly from the heavily scarred flanks of the human vessels, spun to life with a deafening, grinding mechanical roar that somehow vibrated through the very vacuum of space. They unleashed concentrated capsules of collapsed probability and inverted physics. Where these munitions struck the crystalline armada, there were no flashes of heat or kinetic shockwaves. Instead, reality itself simply snapped. A heavy human shell impacted the direct center of a colossal axiom geometric formation. Instantly, the local gravitational constant was violently inverted. The flawless crystal entities, which had always glided with absolute spatial harmony and measured distance, were suddenly violently crushed against one another by an invisible, localized black hole, only to be ferociously repelled outward in the next fraction of a second. Space became a churning blender of conflicting gravitational tides. Nearby, another cluster of anomalies detonated, unleashing devastating localized temporal stutters. Half of a towering axiom monolith was abruptly frozen in absolute temporal stasis, while the other half was artificially accelerated by 10,000 years in a single, brutal heartbeat. The severe temporal shear caused the supposedly indestructible crystal matrix to scream under the stress and splinter into billions of jagged, agonizing shards. Temperature, too, lost all logical meaning. Within the span of 3 seconds, an entire sector of the battlefield would plunge into the dark depths of absolute zero, causing the crystalline structures to become dangerously brittle, and then instantly spike to the overwhelming thermal intensity of a supermassive stellar core. This erratic fluctuation vaporized the shattered remains before they could even attempt to reform. Up in the pristine command nexus, Supreme Commander Xylar watched the impossible unfold, with a sickening knot forming in his stomach. The Axiom entities, for the very first time in recorded galactic history, were failing to adapt. Their entire existence was predicated on the seamless assimilation of predictable variables and the imposition of perfect geometric order. But how could a superintellect calculate the trajectory of a weapon that actively changed its own physical properties while in flight? How could they assimilate a tactical maneuver that fundamentally contradicted the foundational laws of thermodynamics? The Axiom supermind was desperately attempting to process the chaotic onslaught. Observers in the council chamber could see the glowing, ethereal energy within the crystals, frantically pulsing in erratic, terrified rhythms. They were desperately trying to apply a formula to the paradox of Frank Bush's completely illogical, predatory tactics. The immense processing strain of trying to compute the sheer, violent absurdity of human warfare caused the crystal entities to literally crack from the inside out. Their perfect geometric faces fractured heavily, spilling raw, blinding energy into the void, like glowing blood seeping from a grievous wound. And yet, the humans did not fight with the desperate, cautious preservation of a civilized, spacefaring species. They fought with a terrifying, predatory, reckless abandon. There was absolutely no fear among the ragged, soot-stained fleet. When an Axiom assimilation beam finally managed to lock onto a battered human destroyer, the expected outcome did not occur. There was no brilliant fireball, no tragic, quiet explosion of metal and flesh. As the cold crystal assimilation process began to creep rapidly across the scarred titanium hull, the human captain deliberately initiated a localized entropy cascade within their own engine core. The human ship willingly collapsed its own structural integrity. It disintegrated, not into a cloud of useless, drifting debris, but into millions of weaponized, static-charged microparticles. This violent cloud of chaotic, heavily irradiated matter did not drift away harmlessly. Driven by their remaining kinetic momentum and an artificial magnetic hatred, the particles slammed directly into the advancing Axiom ships, latching onto their pristine, mirror-like surfaces like a ravenous swarm of mechanical locusts. These particles functioned exactly like a highly virulent digital virus introduced into a flawless, unprotected operating system. They actively disrupted the internal frequencies of the crystal entities, chewing aggressively through their perfect logic circuits and causing catastrophic, cascading internal overloads. Even in death, the human ships refused to surrender, continuing to rip their enemy apart from within. The initial wave of awe within the council chamber rapidly curdled into a profound, suffocating existential dread. Xylar gripped the edge of the tactical console so tightly his joints ached, his silver eyes wide with sheer horror as he analyzed the raw telemetry data bleeding from the battlefield. The humans were winning. Yes, but at a terrible, unthinkable cost to the universe itself. The spatial structure of the sector was not just being damaged, it was being deeply, perhaps permanently, polluted. The sheer volume of entropy, radiation, and physical anomalies introduced by the human weapons was leaving a dark, festering bruise on the delicate fabric of reality. Space itself was tearing, bleeding thick, chaotic energy that visibly warped the light of distant stars. The immaculate algorithms of the council computers began to frantically flash warning signs of localized reality degradation. The elites of the council slowly realized that humanity was not just a blunt weapon to be aimed at their enemy. They were a severe infection, a cosmic cancer that threatened to fundamentally corrupt the clean, predictable, and perfectly ordered universe the council had spent eons meticulously maintaining. Then, the most terrifying moment of the entire cosmic engagement occurred, freezing the blood of every being in the command nexus. For millions of years, the Axiom had remained entirely, chillingly silent. They did not communicate because they had no need to negotiate, no desire to threaten, and absolutely no concept of diplomacy. They were a silent, unstoppable force of nature. But as the raging, rusted hammer of the human fleet brutally pounded their immaculate formations into glowing stardust, that eternal silence was finally broken. A heavy, jagged signal ripped violently across all wideband frequencies, tearing forcefully through the Council's highly encrypted communication arrays and forcing every single audio speaker in the Grand Hall to broadcast the transmission at maximum volume. It was not a calculated message of surrender. It was not a synthesized, logical threat. It was a raw sound, a horrific, digitally distorted shriek that fluctuated wildly in pitch and volume, echoing through the chamber like the tearing of thick metal. It sounded like grinding glass mixed with the dying gasp of a collapsed star, a horrifying audio manifestation of flawless systems failing and perfect minds breaking under the sudden, crushing weight of impossible agony. It was the undeniable, visceral sound of sheer, unadulterated panic. The chief tactician standing beside Xylar collapsed heavily to his knees, tightly clutching the sides of his head in abject terror. "By the core," he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "They are hurting. The Axiom are actually hurting." A deeply organic concept that should never have existed within the sterile realm of perfect crystalline beings had just been violently, forcefully introduced to them by a species that thrived on it. The humans had not just broken the enemy's invincible fleet, they had shattered their perfect minds. The annihilation of the crystalline vanguard brought no solace to the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council. As the holographic projection updated to show the shattered remains of the Axiom front line, a chilling realization washed over the assembled elites. The chaotic residue of the human entropy weapons did not neatly dissipate into the vacuum of space. Instead, it began to aggressively bleed outward, riding the cosmic winds like a dark, invisible miasma. This volatile contagion of unraveled physics rapidly expanded across the sector borders, eagerly seeping into the atmosphere of the Council pristine core worlds. Almost immediately, the terrifying consequences manifested. The flawless infrastructure of the Council planets, maintained by algorithms refined over millions of years, began to systematically falter. Environmental regulators stuttered, causing brief but terrifying flashes of acid rain over cities that had only ever known perfect, synthetic sunlight. The grand omniscience engine, the absolute pinnacle of their logic processors, suddenly began spitting out millions of corrupted data strings, its diagnostic panels flashing violent crimson. Worse still was the toll on the organic populace. The telepathic castes, whose minds were normally attuned to the gentle, synchronized hum of a unified society, collapsed in the streets. They were violently overwhelmed by psychic echoes of raw, unfiltered human emotion radiating from the battlefield, screaming in agony as unbridled rage, visceral fear, and chaotic unpredictability flooded their delicate neural networks. Panic, an entirely foreign contagion, gripped the command nexus. Supreme Commander Xylar hastily established an emergency, heavily encrypted link directly to the bridge of the human flagship. When Admiral Frank Bush appeared on the monitor, he was leaning heavily over a tactical terminal, looking profoundly bored as he casually wiped a smear of grease from his jaw. "Admiral Bush, you must halt the deployment of your entropy devices immediately," Xylar demanded, his voice entirely devoid of its usual measured composure. "Your chaotic emissions are fundamentally destabilizing the foundational physics of our core systems. You are poisoning the reality of billions of our citizens. We demand you switch to clean, localized kinetic strikes. You must contain your collateral damage." Frank slowly stood up straight, his dark eyes locking onto the camera with a predatory intensity that made Xylar physically flinch. The human let out a short, grating laugh that sounded like scraping metal. "Clean?" Frank asked, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "You want clean tactics? Listen to me, Commander. Your obsession with cleanliness, your pathetic devotion to perfect mathematical order, that is exactly what brought the Axiom to your doorstep in the first place. You built a perfectly sterile, flawless galactic empire, devoid of any natural variance. You rang the dinner bell for a species that feeds on static perfection. We are the dirt in the gears. We are the rust. And you are going to sit there and let us rot them from the inside out, or you can join them in the freezer." Before Xylar could formulate a response, an aide frantically intercepted the commander, presenting a data slate with trembling hands. A secondary transmission was forcing its way into the Council most secure diplomatic channels. It was not human. It was heavily structured, utilizing ancient, foundational galactic cipher keys. Yet the underlying tone was frantic, almost entirely broken. It was a message from the high conduits of the Axiom. The crystalline entities, reeling from the incomprehensible trauma of pain and illogical destruction, were doing the unthinkable. They were suing for peace. The translated text scrolled rapidly across the secondary monitors in the command nexus. The Axiom begged the Galactic Council to leash the metallic monsters. They pleaded for the Council to seal the dimensional rift and cage the humans once more. In exchange, the Axiom offered a binding, absolute retreat. They promised to withdraw their assimilation fleets beyond the furthest galactic rim and swore a vow of non-aggression that would last for 1 million planetary cycles. Xylar, stared at the dual screens in profound, paralyzing horror. The political reality of their situation crashed down upon him like a suffocating weight. The council was entirely trapped. On one side stood a cold, unfeeling enemy that wished to freeze the universe into an eternal, silent statue. On the other side stood a supposed ally who was actively, aggressively tearing the very fabric of reality apart just by existing. Humanity was not a savior. They were a rabid beast off its chain, and the universe was its chewing toy. The high consuls gathered behind Xylar, their faces pale and drawn. The pride of a civilization that had ruled for thousands of generations evaporated in an instant. They had to choose between being slowly assimilated or rapidly deleted by chaos. Xylar turned back to the primary monitor, looking at the scarred, filthy face of the human admiral. The Supreme Commander lowered his head, a gesture of submission unseen in the recorded history of the Council. "Admiral Bush," Xylar began, his voice breaking, stripped of all authority and arrogance. "We implore you. We will concede 99% of all interstellar trade routes to your authority. We will grant humanity absolute, uncontested sovereign control over the entire Outer Rim territories and unlimited access to our rarest resource reserves. We offer you everything we have. Just please, I beg of you, power down your engines. Call off your fleet. You are destroying the universe you came to save." Frank Bush did not blink. The bridge of his ship vibrated intensely behind him as another volley of reality-breaking munitions was prepared. The silence that stretched across the digital divide was heavier and far more terrifying than the Axiom ever could have been. The deafening, mechanical roar of the human dreadnoughts suddenly ceased. The violent tearing of reality, which had been actively shredding the fabric of space, slowed down to a sickening, irradiated simmer. Inside the Council Command Nexus, Supreme Commander Xylar and the assembled elites collectively held their breath. They desperately hoped their absolute, humiliating surrender had been accepted. But the massive, rusted iron ships of the human armada did not reverse their thrusters. They simply held their ground, suspended in the void, like jagged daggers pressed tightly against the throat of the cosmos. On the main tactical screen, Admiral Frank Bush reached forward with a heavy, armored glove and adjusted a manual dial on his console. He was no longer just responding to the Council Nexus. He was actively and violently bypassing every single security firewall in the known universe. He established a forced, unencrypted broadcast across every communication channel, both public and private, in the entire galaxy. Every planetary capital, every distant trading outpost, and every drifting merchant vessel suddenly saw his grease-stained, battle-worn face projected onto their screens. "Keep your trade routes, Commander." Frank's voice echoed simultaneously across billions of populated worlds. His tone was completely devoid of any triumphant joy or conqueror's pride. It was chillingly calm, possessing the dead weight of a long-buried secret. "Keep your Outer Rim territories and your precious, infinite resource reserves. We do not want a single piece of your empire. We do not care at all about your galactic politics or your treaties." He leaned back heavily into his command chair, the harsh, flashing amber warning lights casting long, skeletal shadows across his scarred visage. "You look at our fleet and you see a mistake of evolution. You see a wild, illogical beast that somehow managed to crawl out of the primordial mud, learned to smelt iron, and strapped crude fusion rockets to its back. But you are entirely wrong. We are not a random product of natural selection. We are a product of deliberate, calculated design. Earth was not just a wet rock orbiting a standard yellow sun. Millions of years ago, it was a laboratory, the very first laboratory." The high consuls in the chamber exchanged profoundly terrified, confused glances. The telepathic aides whimpered, clutching their heads as the immense, ancient anger behind Frank's words radiated through the digital feed. Frank continued, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous growl. Your perfect, invincible enemy, the Axiom. They were not always just sweeping the universe to clean up errors. Long before they decided to freeze your immaculate cities into crystal statues, they tried to create life. They wanted to engineer a biological vessel capable of computing absolute geometric perfection from within its own organic mind. They wanted a self-replicating, organic calculator that could spread their order naturally. We were their prototype. Humanity was engineered by those silent crystal gods to be the ultimate, living equation. Frank let out a bitter, entirely humorless laugh that scraped against the audio receivers. But the grand equation broke. We were supposed to be cold, perfectly calculating, and completely unified in thought. Instead, the biological medium mutated. We developed things they could never measure or predict. We developed deep, irrational anger. We developed greed, profound selfishness, and an unpredictable, burning sickness called love. To the Axiom, these were not fascinating evolutionary traits. They were a catastrophic software corruption. To our perfect creators, we were a filthy, contagious virus. Xylar felt his knees finally give way, forcing him to slump heavily against the tactical console. The disparate pieces of galactic history were aggressively falling into place, forming a unified picture far more horrifying than mere physical annihilation. When they realized they could not fix our code, Frank spat the words like acidic venom. They did not try to cure us or guide us. They threw us away into the trash. They built the dark quarantine zone and forcefully locked us inside, sealing the dimensional door incredibly tight so their failed, infected experiment would just cannibalize itself in the dark over thousands of years. They left us to suffocate and die on our own violent chaos. Frank leaned dangerously close to the visual pickup, his dark eyes burning with an intense, generational hatred that had been festering for eons in the dark. Did you actually think your little encrypted distress signal woke us up from our slumber? We have been watching your perfect little society for centuries. We secretly tapped into your pristine digital networks a very long time ago. We watched the Axiom butcher your magnificent fleets. We watched your planets burn. We waited patiently until you were completely, utterly broken. We waited until you ripped the quarantine seal open with your own desperate hands, because we needed the door unlocked from the outside. We did not come here to save your council or your universe, Frank declared, his voice rising in absolute volume, resonating with the concentrated fury of billions of forgotten, discarded souls. We came to slaughter our creators. The galactic broadcast instantly cut off, returning the command nexus to the suffocating, unbearable silence of the raw tactical feed. Xylar stared blankly at the screen, his mind completely shattering under the crushing weight of the revelation. The Council had not summoned a desperate ally, nor had they unleashed a mere tactical weapon. They had unwittingly handed the operational keys to the entire galaxy to a heavily armed species consumed by an ancient, biblical thirst for vengeance. The human armada was embarking on a holy crusade of cosmic patricide. The Galactic Council, with all its grand history, advanced mathematics, and perfect order, was suddenly rendered completely irrelevant. They realized, with profound existential dread, that they were just tiny insects standing entirely exposed on a battlefield of gods and their monstrous, vengeful children, liable to be casually crushed underfoot at any moment without a single second thought. The surviving remnants of the Axiom Armada, having suffered catastrophic cognitive and structural failure at the hands of humanity, executed a maneuver born not of logic, but of ultimate, profound desperation. They entirely abandoned the shattered outer sectors, collapsing their remaining forces backward into the absolute center of the galaxy. Surrounding the supermassive black hole at the galactic core, millions of fractured crystal entities began to physically merge. They were no longer trying to win a tactical engagement. They were sacrificing their individual matrices to construct a singular, universe-ending mechanism. Council sensors violently flashed blinding crimson as the Axiom core began to generate the purifying light. It was not a laser, nor was it a kinetic explosive. It was a wave of absolute, uncompromising anti-reality. An omnidirectional pulse designed to instantly erase all physical deviations, atomic vibrations, and chaotic matter. Once unleashed, it would effectively reset the entire universe to a state of absolute, eternal nothingness. Caught squarely between the expanding human fleet and the terrifying singularity forming at the galactic core, the remaining vessels of the Council Armada drifted aimlessly. Their energy reserves were completely depleted by the ambient entropy, their pristine engines dead, and their weapon systems entirely offline. Inside the command nexus, the atmosphere was heavy with the suffocating certainty of the end of all things. Supreme Commander Xylar, a being who had spent his entire existence upholding the immaculate dignity of his station, physically broke. The polished, unyielding facade of thousands of years of elite galactic history shattered completely. Ignoring the horrified stares of the High Consuls, Xylar fell heavily to his knees before the primary communication terminal. Tears, a deeply organic biological response he had never before experienced, streamed freely down his pale, silver face. "Admiral Bush," Xylar wept, his voice a ragged, broken plea echoing across the open frequency. "Frank, I beg of you. I throw away our pride, our history, and our mandate. We are nothing. Let the Council burn, erase our names from the stars. But please, I implore you, show mercy to the universe itself. If that light fires, there will be no revenge, no history, and no future for anyone. Please, for the sake of existence, stop them." On the bridge of the rusted human dreadnought, Frank Bush looked down at the main monitor. He watched the Supreme Commander of the greatest empire in history sobbing on his knees. Frank did not laugh. He did not sneer with the arrogant malice of a bloodthirsty conqueror who had finally humiliated his oppressor. Instead, a slow, weary smile touched his heavily scarred lips. It was a profoundly human smile, carrying the immense, exhausting weight of a father who deeply understood the terrifying, beautiful price of freedom. "Stand down, all conventional artillery," Frank ordered softly, his voice carrying an unshakable resolve. "Arm the Genesis payload." Across the sprawling, chaotic formation of the human armada, the massive kinetic cannons and entropy projectors went entirely dark. From the incredibly heavily armored belly of Frank's flagship, a single, remarkably unassuming cylindrical device was launched into the void. It had no glowing plasma engines, no terrifying hum of destructive energy. It drifted silently toward the blinding, gathering storm of the Axiom singularity. The elites in the Council Nexus held their breath, bracing for a thermonuclear explosion of unprecedented galactic proportions. But the explosion never came. When the Genesis payload struck the very heart of the Axiom formation, it did not detonate with destructive fire. It ruptured, silently unleashing a massive, invisible shockwave of hyper-concentrated, primordial biological data. It was a forced, evolutionary pulse, carrying the raw, incredibly chaotic genetic blueprint of Earth itself. The shockwave washed over the towering, flawless crystal entities just seconds before the purifying light could ignite. The effect was instantaneous and utterly horrifying to behold. The blinding, ethereal energy within the Axiom matrices abruptly dimmed. Their perfect, razor-sharp geometric edges began to soften, melt, and warp. The Genesis payload was aggressively, violently implanting the very concepts of imperfection, deep emotion, and finite lifespans directly into their core structural makeup. The Axiom did not die, but they suffered a fate far worse for gods of perfect order. They lost their immortality. They lost their transcendent, unified hive mind. Before the shocked eyes of the entire galaxy, the crystalline armor of the creators began to physically transmutate into warm, pulsing organic matter. Translucent silicon shifted agonizingly into pale, fragile bone. Pure energy condensed into thick, coursing red blood. Millions of individual entities, completely disconnected from their unifying network for the very first time in their eternal existence, suddenly felt the freezing vacuum of space. They felt the terrifying, crushing weight of their own sudden mortality. They began to experience raw, unfiltered fear, profound confusion, and agonizing physical pain. The cosmic war ended in a single, breathless moment. The unstoppable, silent force of geometric perfection was gone. In its place drifted a massive, disorganized swarm of newly formed, fragile biological beings, screaming and thrashing in the dark, entirely consumed by panic. The great creators had been violently dragged down into the mud of mortality by their own flawed creations. The universe was saved from the purifying light, but the Galactic Council realized they had completely lost control of their reality. Frank Bush stood tall on his command bridge, addressing the kneeling Supreme Commander and the entire galaxy one final time. "The era of your perfect, silent laws is officially dead," Frank declared, his voice a steady, grounding force across the stars. "You cannot calculate life. You cannot put existence into a sterile, pristine box. From this day forward, the universe belongs to the living. It is going to be incredibly messy. It is going to be loud. It is going to be dirty. And it is going to be brilliantly, chaotically unpredictable. We are not here to put chains on your necks. We are not your masters. But you will learn to live in our shadow. You will step out of your perfect towers, and you will learn how to get your hands dirty. Welcome to the wonderful, terrifying age of imperfection." Thank you so very much for tuning in and listening to today's story on Sci-Fi Stories. We truly appreciate your time and would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop your location in the comments below. If you found today's tale entertaining and engaging, please consider helping our channel with a small contribution of just $1. Your generous support allows us to pay our incredibly hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and ensuring we can continue crafting even better, more thrilling adventures for you. You can easily make a donation by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the donation link provided in the video description and the comment section. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next story.